I'd like to go to the architecture now, Toshiko, and you're especially interesting in this discussion because of your experience with building next to a Wright house. And in fact, building next to historic houses that need respect and at the same time need distance and need connection at the same time. So it's a really interesting thing that you're part of.
Well, thank you, Susan. I worked for a visitor center for Darwin Martin House in Buffalo, New York, built between 1904 to 1906. So if you can imagine that Darwin Martin House is a big sister of Maya May House. It's very highly elaborate. It shares a similar details and similar design in glass windows, motifs, furniture layouts, as they share a lot of coloration palette strategy for lighting. So in a sense, for me to come and see this house is meeting somebody very familiar, like little sister. So it was very lovely to be in the house, experiencing it. And also, I have to say something about Frank Lloyd Wright in studying his work, which has been 5 years studying his work and trying to build next to it. Well, Frank Lloyd Wright always approved of building next to it, adding to his house or buildings, as long as he was the architect. So it was a very intimidating task, and I keep saying that. I was so glad he was dead. I assure you I wouldn't be here if he was alive, but anyway, for different reasons. But also, when you read those principles, as opposed to someone like Le Corbusier, who's truly dogmatic and systematic in writing with his French-Swiss rationalism, Frank Lloyd Wright, as a personality, is rambling. He just keeps on writing, repeats himself, goes on. He says 10 principles, but all the principles get mixed up. But that's the way he is. He's a very synthetic person who connects one ideas to each other. To me, one phrase, connectivity, which he talks about weaving when he does this gesture of connecting two hands and pushing and pulling. This idea of interweaving of elements, how everything connects together, becomes an entity. Before the word sustainable was invented, he was talking about organic principles. It's absolutely the same thing. In a sense, it's much more holistic, much more wholesome in terms of principles. So in a way, for me, what he wrote, what he talked about is very contemporary. It's about our time, and it's also about the future. It's intrinsic, timeless qualities.
So it's also very interesting because you built a very modern visitor center next to the Darwin Martin House, which uses these amazingly prescient principles in a very modern way, and that interpretive way that he talked about. You mentioned one detail that really sort of summed it up for me when you mentioned how the glass wall meets the ground. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
This visitor center is three-sided, it's glass, it's floor to ceiling, triple glazing, Buffalo, New York, and it's a contrasting material against the brick. And when you look at the precedence of a glass house, when you look at Mies, who floats it, suspends it above, and then Philip Johnson, who let the glass detail sit on it. In the Frank Lloyd Wright principle, he says that the buildings always has to grow from a ground. And what does it mean by grow? It means an organic, intrinsic relationship. So it has to perform well in terms of drainage. But in a sense, my struggle is how to detail this particular pavilion. Literally, glass goes about 6 inches below grade, and I had to detail everything in it to take care of a thermal break in terms of drainage. But literally, the glass grows from a ground up.
Beautiful. Thank you. So now that materials inside out the house are incredibly impressive, because he's always looking at the newest, most interesting materials. The houses and the buildings are always about experimentation, and the clients were willing to do this and finance all of this, and we're not going to touch that one here, but because we don't have that culture anymore. But the reality is that materials are huge, and in any stage of architecture and design. So Andrew, as our materials expert and researcher on this panel, Can you talk a little bit about that principle that especially hit you and why it's important for a materials researcher to kind of continue the right thinking and the right thinking? Yes.
Whenever I'm sourcing new materials, we often, or looking at who's using new materials, often it is the artists who are the most experimental, the ones who are taking materials to much greater degrees, so testing them to their limits. An engineer will always want to work within a set of limits. We'll always know, okay, this is what the material can do, so therefore let's work within those limits. What I found with researching Wright's work was that often he would try and go beyond those limits because he had the artist's love of experimentation with a new material. He said, okay, I've got steel, I can put steel inside my concrete. What can I do with it? How long a line can I get without it collapsing? And didn't always work. For me also, his embracing of what he called the machine age, the ability to create steel and glass on a large scale. He obviously understood the way that we were going to head with those materials, the ability to produce them in very large volumes, in very exact ways as well. Steel and glass have the ability to be, again, in very long, clean lines to produce them accurately. And it also had changed, it created a complete change in the way that we saw architecture at the beginning of the 20th century. I wonder what he would do with some of the new materials we have now. I thought it was interesting that the use of materials inside the house, he's still using quite traditional materials. The inside of the house looks much more dated than the outside in terms of material use. If we think about modern interiors, we're seeing now much more the use of plastic. Plastic is prevalent in office interiors, it's prevalent in our own interiors. And that, so you can see there's a big difference between the modernity we see, say perhaps with the steel case, and this sort of interior because the materials are different. Whereas the outside, the actual structure of the building, we're still using the same sorts of materials. It's rare that you can get a building which uses a completely new material. We're still relying upon our basic ones of concrete, glass, steel, the sorts of materials that he was using.
So that's really interesting because I have a feeling that Wright would be camped out at Material Connection every week, going through your materials and touching them, feeling them, and trying to figure out how to use them. And so that, is there any development that you see as the holder of this incredible material invention that gives us an idea that this kind of thinking is going on and there artists and architects are really looking at their materials, or is there a lot of fear of new materials right now?
We had an incredible new material explosion over the last perhaps 10 to 15 years. We're seeing it back down a little bit. I mean, having looked for new materials, constantly looking for new materials, nothing really in the last 5 years, but what we have seen is a greater understanding of our existing technologies. So in the way that, so once you have a new material, you have the engineers who want to constrain, you have the artists who want to expand. It takes a while with new materials to experiment to find out the full range of possibilities. So I think, although we haven't seen in the last 5 years a host of really wonderful new materials, we're getting better at using our existing palette. And I think also we are understanding that natural materials, materials that come from a biological source, may not be so bad after all. As we've heard that we're trying to get away from nature through the past few millennia. Now we're understanding that it's probably a good thing, as Frank Lloyd Wright did, to actually embrace nature to a certain extent. I think we're doing that with the new materials. We've seen a machine age, an industrial age where everything is synthetic. There's nothing wrong with that, but I think now we're understanding that nature has a greater role to play in our materials, whether we grow them, whether we simply just use the nature's principle in the way that they work. But I think we moved away during the machine age for believing that we could do better than nature. And now we're coming back to understand that maybe nature has a lot to teach us.
And it's interesting that Wright is the one who's accused of arrogance. You know, and here we are, generations of arrogant people. We can do better than nature. Okay, that's another big discussion.